Chapter 9, Section 5 notes is solving the quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this part right here is called the discriminant. And it kind of determines how many answers you have. So the b squared minus 4ac is called the discriminant. If the discriminant is bigger than 0, that means you have a quadratic equation that looks something like this. And that's just a sketch. And that means you have two solutions. And honestly, this is what happens most of the time. If your discriminant is exactly 0, then that means that your graph comes down and touches here in exactly one place and goes back up. And that means we only have one solution. And if d is smaller than 0, that means you're trying to take the square root of a negative number, which is not possible. It means your graph looks something like this, and that means there are no solutions. So the discriminant determines how many values we have, how many solutions. If it's bigger than 0, we have two solutions. If it equals 0, we have one solution. And if it's smaller than 0, you cannot take the square root of a negative, so there are no solutions. So down here, using the discriminant, determine the number of real solutions of the equation. And just so you know, the number in front of the x is the a. The number in front of the x squared is the a. The number in front of the x is the b, and this is the c. So we will have negative b, which becomes negative So we're putting this into just the discriminant. So we're just putting this into the b squared minus 4ac. I was trying to put it into the whole equation. So here's our b. So we will do b squared minus 4. A is right here, which is negative 1. And c is right here, which is 3. So that becomes 36. Negative 4 times negative 1 is 4, times 3 is 12. The negative times a negative makes it a plus 12. So that value is 48. 48 is above 0, so that means we have two solutions. Number 2, our a value is 1. Our b value is negative 6, and our c value is 9. A, b, and c. Using our discriminant, we want b squared, so negative 6 squared, minus 4 times a times c. So 4 times 1 times 9. So that becomes 36. 4 times 1 times 9 is 36. So that is 0. And if we look back up here, that means our graph touches in exactly one place. So that means one solution. Number 3, our a value is 1. Our b value is 3. And our c value is 2. So we will do b squared, which is 3 squared, minus 4 times 1 times 8, which becomes 9 minus 32. And I think that's a negative 23. And since this is a negative, you cannot take the square root of a negative, so there are no solutions. And if we graphed it, it would look something like this. So these three questions, we use the discriminant. If it was bigger than 0, there are 2 solutions. If it's exactly 0, there's 1 solution. And if it's a negative, there are no solutions. Now the next 4 questions are solving using the quadratic formula. And I'm going to write my quadratic formula here again. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So right here, a is 1, b is negative 10, and c is 16. So we have negative b, negative and a negative will make that a 10, plus or minus the square root of negative 10 squared, b squared minus 4 times 1 times 16, all over 2a, which is 2 times 1. And I usually start inside this whole monstrosity, this square root thing. So that would be 100. Negative 4 times 16, I think is 64. So that becomes 10 plus or minus the square root of 36 all over 2, which is 10 plus or minus 6 all over 2. So I'm going to separate that into 10 plus 6 over 2 and 10 minus 6 over 2. This plus or minus means we actually have 2 answers. We need to add it, and then we need to subtract it. 10 plus 2 is 16, divided by 2 is 8. 10 minus 6 is 4, divided by 2 is 2. Number 5, my A is 3, my B is negative 1, and my C is negative 2. Quadratic formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So negative b, negative and a negative, will make that a 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So that becomes 1 plus or minus. I'm going to do a little calculation here. 1, negative 4 times 3 is negative 12. Times 2 is a 24, and the negative in a negative makes it a positive. So all of this becomes 1 plus 24. So this will be 1 plus or minus the square root of 25 over 6. Square root of 25 becomes 5. And so my 2 answers will be 1 plus 5 over 6 and 1 minus 5 over 6. 1 plus 5 is 6, which is 6 divided by 6 is 1. 1 minus 5 is a negative 4 over 6 is a negative 2/3. Number 6, this one is not in the right formula yet, not in the right form. We need to have everything on one side. We need to have this thing equal to 0. And now our A is 1, our B is 6, and our C is negative 13. Our formula, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that will be negative 6 plus or minus b squared, or 6 squared, minus 4 times 1. Oops, just realized I made a mistake. To get rid of this negative 13, I need to add 13 to both sides. So that will be a positive 13. If you have x squared plus 6x equals a negative 13, I added it to both sides. So my x, or my c value, is actually a positive 13. All over 2a, which is 2 times 1. So this would become 36. 4 times 13 would be a minus 52. So we have negative 6 plus or minus the square root of negative 16 all over 2. And since this is a negative, we cannot do the square root of a negative. So that means there is no solution there. Let's see if I can do a little bit better on number 7. Subtracting 4x from both sides, you will have 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 0. So this is my a value, my b is negative 4, and my c is 1. So then we have negative b, negative and a negative make it a positive. 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So this will become a 16. Negative 4 times 4 is a negative 16. So this whole thing right here just becomes a 0. Anything plus 0 is just that number. Subtracting 0 is that number. So you will have 4 over 8, which is 1/2. And our discriminant tells us if this is 0, we only have one solution. So that is our solution. Couple more at the top of the next page. We do not have this one in the correct form. It has to equal 0. So I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides, and that becomes negative 4x squared plus 8x plus 6 equals 0. The a is negative 4, the b is 8, and the c is 6. So we will have negative 8 plus or minus the square root of 8 squared minus 4ac. Careful, the c is the 6, not the 12. All over 2a, which is 2 times negative 4. So this becomes negative 8 plus or minus. That would be 64. Negative 4 times negative 4 is a 16. Times 6, I think, is 96. So this would be the square root of 160 all over negative 8. And I don't think I have a calculator here. You would have to do the square root of 160. So that would be negative 8 plus the square root of 160 divided by negative 8, and negative 8 minus the square root of 160 all over negative 8. And your answer should be negative 0.58 and 2.58. And those are our two solutions. Number 9, I'm going to add 7 to both sides. Negative 3x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. So a is negative 3, b is 5, and c is 6. So I have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So that becomes negative 5 plus or minus something over negative 6. This would be a 25. 4 times 3 is 12. Times 6, I believe, is 72. So negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 97. So negative 5 plus the square root of 97 all over negative 6 is a negative 0.81. And a negative 5 minus the square root of 97 all over a negative 6 is a 2.47. Number 10, I'm going to use the quadratic formula. Guess I should have written that. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. In this case, a is 3, b is 1, c is negative 5. So negative b, negative 1, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. So that becomes negative 1 plus or minus. So this is a 1, and that's 60. So the square root of 60 all over 6. And if you do negative 1 plus the square root of 60 over 6, I believe you end up with 1.14. And negative 1 minus the square root of 60 over 6 is a negative 1.47. Number 11, we could do the quadratic formula on this one. However, it says to solve by any method. And I think if we square root this, we would have x plus 2 equals plus or minus 8. And we can break that into two equations. X plus 2 equals 8. X plus 2 equals negative 8. And if you subtract 2 from both sides, you have x equals 6. Subtracting 2, x equals negative 10. So 6 and negative 10 are our two solutions. Number 12, if I factor this, I could pull a 3x out of there. And then that would be x squared minus 25. And I'm going to factor this again. That is the difference of two perfect squares. So x plus 5, x minus 5. And then one of these things has to equal 0. So if 3x equals 0, x equals 0. If x plus 5 equals 0, x equals negative 5. And if x minus 5 equals 0, x equals 5. Number 13, we have to get this equal to 0 first, so I'm going to subtract 16 from both sides. And then that becomes x squared minus 4x minus 12 equals 0. And I'm going to try to solve this one by factoring. Can anybody think of two numbers that multiply together to get a negative 12 and add together to get a negative 4? So that will be an x minus 6 and an x plus 2. So one of these two things has to equal 0, so x will equal 6 or x will equal negative 2. And 14, square pool has a side of length X. A uniform border around the pool is 1 foot wide. That's my best at being uniform. The total area of the pool and the border is 361 square feet. What is the area of the pool? So this whole thing right here, all the way across, is x plus 2. So we have x plus 2 times x plus 2 equals 361. And it's 2 because you have one side here, or 1 foot there, 1 foot here, 1 foot here, and 1 foot here. So this becomes x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 361. From there, you subtract 361 from both sides, which is x squared plus 4x minus 357 equals 0. And now that we have it equal to 0, we can factor this. And that becomes x plus 21, x minus 17. And don't worry if you couldn't factor that one. You could also do the quadratic formula. It's a pretty large number to factor. This would be a negative 21, and we can't have a negative answer. So right here, x will be 17. However, that's not our final answer. The question says, what is the area of the pool? So the pool is 17 by 17, which is 289 square feet.